May 1941. The sun beat down with an unfamiliar, oppressive heat as Gefreiter Karl-Heinz Schmeissing of the 3rd Company, Meerbataillon, Luftlandesturmregiment, slammed into the Cretan soil. The linen ripcord still danced in the air above him, but the dreamlike descent of Fallschirmjäger had shattered into a violent awakening. He'd barely shucked his harness when the crack of a rifle, not German, not British, rang out, chipping stone inches from his face. This wasn't the neat, coordinated drop described in their briefings. This was chaos, a whirlwind of dust, shouts, and an entirely unexpected, visceral hostility. Schmeissing crawled for cover, his MP-40 clutched tight, scanning the gnarled olive trees. He saw no uniform, no helmet, just the glint of sunlight off an ancient shotgun barrel held by a man in dark, civilian clothes, his face a mask of primal fury. The intelligence reports had mentioned British and Commonwealth troops, certainly, but this was different. This was raw, untamed, and utterly terrifying. But the island would quickly reveal a brutal truth far removed from their maps and neatly printed orders. Operation Mercury, the first truly airborne invasion in history, had been conceived by General Lieutenant Kurt Student, commander of the Antis, Flieger Corps, as a bold stroke. Its objectives were clear: seize the island of Crete, a vital British air and naval base in the eastern Mediterranean, and solidify Axis control over the Aegean. The preliminary assessments, presented to the highest echelons of the Wehrmacht, painted a picture of a relatively swift victory. British defenses were deemed adequate at best, their morale questionable after recent defeats on the mainland. German propaganda, echoing these sentiments, dismissed the local populace as passive, unequipped, and largely irrelevant to a modern blitzkrieg. According to intelligence estimates delivered to student staff, the main resistance would come from Commonwealth regulars, easily overwhelmed by the superior training and shock tactics of the Fallschirmjäger. They were told to expect a fight, but one against a professional, if weary, foe. What they utterly failed to grasp was the deeper, primal spirit of the island itself. Then came the morning of May 20th. Wave after wave of Junkers Jew, 52 transport aircraft droned over the island, disgorging thousands of elite German paratroopers. The landings, particularly around the crucial airfield at Malem and the urban centers of Heraklion and Rethymno, immediately devolved into savage, close-quarters fighting. German war diaries, later compiled, recount the immediate and shocking discovery of widespread civilian participation. It wasn't just uniformed soldiers returning fire. It was the farmers emerging from their fields, the shepherds from the hills, armed with ancient Mannlicher Schönauer rifles, shotguns, even farming implements. They formed impromptu militias, often with no military training, but with an intimate knowledge of their rugged terrain and an unyielding will to defend their homes. Initial German radio transmissions, logged at divisional headquarters, expressed bewilderment and outrage, describing fanatical resistance from armed civilians and women with knives. The meticulously planned assault was instantly bogged down by an enemy they hadn't even considered. Lieutenant Alfred Wetzler, leading a platoon near Malem, described in a letter home how his men were ambushed not by conventional forces, but by groups seemingly materializing from the olive groves, engaging in brutal close-range combat before vanishing into the landscape. These were not the rules of war they had been taught. German orders explicitly stated civilians were not combatants. Yet here, grandmothers hurled rocks, teenagers fired antique pistols, and entire villages rose up to engage the most elite soldiers of the Reich. Casualties mounted rapidly amongst the vulnerable paratroopers, many still struggling to retrieve their scattered weapon containers. The shock was profound. The swift, decisive victory they had been promised was slipping away, replaced by a bewildering, bloody street fight. But this was just the beginning of their bitter education. As the days of fighting bled into weeks, the German perception of the Cretan resistance began a slow, grim evolution. The initial outrage at civilian barbarity gave way to a grudging, unsettling respect. War diaries from the 7th Flieger Division increasingly noted the tenacity and courage of the islanders. They observed that even after areas were secured, isolated Fallschirmjäger patrols were still ambushed. Snipers, often identified as local men rather than Allied soldiers, continuously harassed supply lines and exhausted troops. The Cretans' intimate knowledge of the island's labyrinthine gorges and hidden mountain trails allowed them to conduct devastating hit-and-run attacks, seemingly appearing and disappearing at will. This wasn't merely spontaneous defiance. It was becoming clear this was a deeply ingrained communal will to resist. Oberst Bruno Breuer, commander of the 1st Parachute Regiment, later recounted the unparalleled ferocity of the islanders' resistance, a sentiment echoed in many officers' private correspondence. The psychological toll on the Fallschirmjäger was immense. They had trained for conventional battlefields, for clear lines of engagement. Here, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, an invisible threat in every shadow, every olive grove, every mountain pass. The high German casualty figures, far exceeding initial estimates, were not solely attributed to the British and Commonwealth defenders, but increasingly to these determined locals. The term Banditen, initially used to dismiss them as criminals, began to carry a new weight, a dangerous, formidable foe whose courage was undeniable, even if infuriating. The Fallschirmjäger, masters of vertical assault, were now facing a horizontal war, one that gnawed at their very souls. The brutal German reprisals that followed, the wholesale destruction of villages like Candanos, and the mass executions of civilians, were not merely acts of cruelty. They were born of frustration, desperation, and a profound, chilling fear. These were acts designed to break a spirit they simply could not comprehend through conventional military means. The very scale of these atrocities, meticulously documented in German after-action reports and orders from General Student himself, stands as a testament to the depth of the challenge posed by the Cretan people. The Fallschirmjäger, who had conquered much of Europe with relative ease, found themselves mired in a struggle for a small, rocky island, facing an enemy who refused to follow any conventional logic of surrender. Even after the island was officially secured by the end of May 1941, the resistance did not cease. It merely shifted, transforming into a sophisticated, enduring partisan movement that would plague the German occupation for the next 4 years. German occupation diaries consistently lamented the pacification problem, a direct consequence of that initial, shocking defiance. General Lieutenant Kurt Student, reflecting on the campaign years later, famously declared Crete to be the graveyard of the Fallschirmjäger. This stark admission was not just a comment on the cost of the victory in terms of paratrooper lives, but a profound acknowledgement of the indomitable spirit encountered there. For the elite troops of the German airborne, Crete became a battleground where their professional contempt for an inferior foe was shattered, replaced first by confusion, then by a grudging respect, and finally by a lasting awe, mixed with dread for the unyielding heart of a people who simply refused to be conquered. For the paratroopers who survived Crete, the island became synonymous with an indomitable spirit, etched into their memory with blood and fire.